Welcome, everyone. My name is Leslie Waterhouse, Program Chair for the Anoka Coon Rapids, Blaine Area League of Women Voters. Tonight, we're talking about what subminimum wage is, why it's changing in Minnesota, and what these changes could mean for people with disabilities and their families. We'll also look at the barriers people with disabilities face when finding and keeping jobs, and we'll talk about how subminimum wage has been used in the past and what the transition away from it might look like now. And now I'm happy to turn things over to our speaker, Tina Rucci, Public Policy Director at the ARC, Minnesota.
Thank you, Leslie. I'm really excited to be here joining you all tonight, talking about how we can understand the end of subminimum wage in Minnesota. So first off, I just want to describe a little bit about what the ARC Minnesota does. So at the ARC Minnesota, we promote and protect the human rights of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. People with disabilities and their families trust the ARC Minnesota for information, assistance, education, and public policy leadership. While we've been an organization in this field for the last 75 years for people with IDD, we do engage and advocate for the disability community at large. So I'm just going to jump right in. There's a lot to cover here related to subminimum wage. So starting with a history of subminimum wage, it was established by the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. And it was largely created as a law to allow companies and employers to pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage if they had a if sorry, backing up a little bit. It was created to allow employers to pay vets coming back from World War One less than minimum wage in order to get that population back into the workforce. So initially, there was a wage floor of 75% of minimum wage, but that was reduced and eventually eliminated. So the average Minnesotan right now who works in a subminimum wage position makes $4.25 per hour. That's average, like I said, and the last time we checked, which was last year, the lowest minimum wage position was paying 7 cents per hour. And actually, I'm going to back up to that last slide again. Keep in mind in 1938, most jobs in that time period were factory or production based. So employers were hesitant to hire people with disabilities because they couldn't, quote unquote, be as productive as able-bodied people. So the introduction of subminimum wage certificates, or the technical term is 14C, was supposed to incentivize employers to hire disabled vets and get them back into the workforce. So how are wages calculated? A 14C certificate holder, which is a disability services provider, um, is able to do a time study. So, for example, say you're a person with a disability and you're looking to get back into the workforce or into the workforce in general. Um, that employer or service provider that you're working with will do a time study comparing how quickly you as a disabled person can complete a task or complete the job compared to that of a non-disabled person. Um, these time studies are, of course, problematic and outdated, especially because many of the jobs that disabled people are entering into are not necessarily as production based. Think of like 1938 and a lot of factories and industrialization and that kind of thing. The job market is very different now. But they're still using this time study process in order to determine pay. I'm also going to pause and just state that the 14C providers are supposed to be revalidating the time studies, as folks are with disabilities are working with them for I can't recall if it's annually. I can follow up with that information. But they are supposed to be reevaluating on a consistent basis, and we've discovered that they don't always do that. So say you're a person with a disability and you're hired by a 14C provider, they do a one-time time study and then they don't ever reevaluate if you're learning faster on the job, that kind of thing. And so the wage remains stagnant in a lot of cases, which is, of course, is also problematic. Um, so I will also say, just to clarify a little bit more about this 14C certificate, it's illegal for any employer or provider who doesn't hold a 14C certificate to pay an employee less than minimum wage. So this is really important to touch on because there are a lot of people who support subminimum wage for people with disabilities that argue, well, if a person with a disability wants to work for less than minimum wage, why are you trying to stop them? But if you put that into a different context, for example, I could never call my HR person at the ARC and say, I really love my job. You can just pay me $1 an hour. That's illegal. That's illegal. So we can't we can't buy into that argument because minimum wage just needs to be minimum wage, if that makes sense. Um, so currently, subminimum wage is legal across the country, but 18 states individually have eliminated this work type of work. Data shows that in these 18 states, the shift to competitive integrated employment increases employment outcomes for people with disabilities. And I'll talk a little bit more about what competitive integrated employment means in a couple of slides here. But that's the alternative to just forcing people into subminimum wage jobs, assuming that's all they can do. Competitive integrated employment helps build their skills so that they can be in the mainstream workforce. Advocates in Minnesota have been working toward elimination for years. For some reason, I'm newer to this work, so I've only been at the ARC for about 3 years. And I know that advocates, including the ARC Minnesota, have been working on eliminating subminimum wage for many years. Um, but what I've learned is that it's become a partisan issue in Minnesota. So mainly, not entirely, but mainly, a lot of Republicans want to keep subminimum wage, and then a lot of Democrats want to eliminate it. So the arguments are that choice argument that I referenced earlier, versus the labor Fair Labor Standards Act of trying to make sure that people are paid minimum wage or higher, regardless of the work that they do. Um, and that's not been the case in other states. Some of those 18 states that have eliminated subminimum wage work have been red states. Our new CEO at the ARC Minnesota came here from Tennessee, and he was instrumental in eliminating 14C work in Tennessee, which is a red state. And Georgia just eliminated 14C work, and that effort was led by the right. So it doesn't need to be a partisan issue. And I guess the goal is to just make this a nonpartisan across the aisle issue where we can just be valuing the work that people with disabilities do. Um, Now, advocates who do want to keep subminimum wage employment include a lot of providers. I'll say that 14C certificate holders or disability employment service providers are concerned that um, it will be it'll affect their bottom line if they have to pay people minimum wage. So just to break that down a little bit more, 14C certificate holders or disability service providers will have to contract with a certain employer. And if they're contracting, let's just use the example of $16 per hour. If they're contracting for that amount of money with that employer, and then they're also providing services to the employees that they're providing to that employer, paying minimum wage allows them to use that gap, that in between money to provide administrative and support services. Um, the ARC Minnesota believes that there and knows that there is a way to make up that additional administrative cost without any negative impact to the employee with a disability. And there is a lot of data and different models that support that. Additionally, parents and family members have spoken out against eliminating subminimum wage because they're concerned that if their loved one isn't working in one of these subminimum wage jobs, they're afraid that they wouldn't be able to work at all. So just understanding that a lot of these concerns come from a place of fear is important. So, to get back to competitive integrated employment, this is where people with disabilities work in typical workplaces with other community members rather than isolated environments. They earn minimum wage or higher. They have access to training, promotions, and career growth. And that one's really important because a lot of these subminimum wage 14C jobs are a little stagnant, pretty stagnant, where they're doing the same thing. Things like putting matches in matchboxes all day, every day. They're not accessing their skills or their abilities or their interests, and they're not learning or growing on the job. They're kind of just, in my opinion, filling the time. I don't know if that's okay to say, but all jobs are important, but training, promotions, and career growth are vital to competitive integrated employment, which people with disabilities are completely capable of doing. And then lastly, like I said, customized employment tailored to a person's needs and abilities. So when we're talking about legislative changes in this area, in 2023, legislation is funding was passed for providers who wanted to phase out their 14C certificates. So this legislation and funding included technical assistance from DHS. So if a provider was like, I want to switch over from 14C to competitive integrated employment. How do I do that? DHS was available for them to provide that technical assistance. That included training for case managers who are working with people one-on-one, lead agency capacity building grants, and data collecting and reporting. So, what was not included in this legislation was a requirement for 14C providers to end subminimum wage work and transition to competitive integrated employment. So, that's just that last piece that we're really working on. The technical assistance and the funding for providers who opted into transitioning away from 14C was available, but that requirement that they do so was never passed in legislation. So, what the ARC Minnesota and our coalition partners, specifically through the Minnesota Coalition for Disability Wage Justice, is we're continuing to advocate for an end date and a phase out. What that would look like is a 3 to 4 year time period from when it was passed. So if we were successful in passing this legislation this year, we would be looking at 3 or 4 years from now, where providers would have that technical assistance from DHS that I just referenced, and that timeline of 3 to 4 years to be able to transition their business model in order to be successful both from a business standpoint and for the clients that they serve. We do have bill authors and in both the House and the Senate. Senator Aaron May Quaid has been very active on this issue, as well as Representative Jess Hansen. Um, They have both been very active in both the human services path in the past, where the governor has also tried to get this through on his human services bill. But the strategy for 2026, because all that technical assistance was already passed, that's the human services part. That DHS requirement, that's the human services program side of the legislation. Really, what's left is the labor stuff, right? It's a Fair Labor Act legislation that needs to be passed now, moving forward. So we've been working with the governor's office and labor committee members to pass that last piece of requiring the phase out to get that through. Like I said, it's a labor issue. All the human services stuff has been taken care of. Um, so I linked here, just this is a general slide that I use on all of my public policy presentations that I do for the ARC. If you have any interest or any specific stories to share related to this issue or any other issues that the ARC Minnesota is working on, that's going to be that first link. Connecting with your legislators, if this is something that you're passionate about, or any, like I said, any of our other legislative agenda items, um, connecting with your legislators is super important, which I'm sure you all know. Um, and then we also have Capital Connectors teams at the ARC. So those are different groups from around the state, which operate out of each congressional district. Just another way to stay connected year round on the things that we're doing. And then we also have a Capital Connector newsletter that will provide further engagement opportunities throughout, especially through session, but throughout the year as well. And then lastly is my contact information. I feel like I kind of flew through that. So, questions or comments?
Thank you, Tina. Yeah, we do have a couple questions. So one of the questions was, are disabled high school students covered under the 14C or another program, and are disabled veterans still covered by the program?
So, I'm gonna pose a counter question. And when you say covered, what is exactly meant by covered?
I will. Do you want to chime in there, Julie? You put the question in there on that one. Are you-
Yes, I see high school students that take a bus to work at fast food restaurants, for example, and I know someone whose job is to help place them. Does that mean those restaurants have to have a 14C, or is this a different program between the schools and the state?
That is a great question. Thank you, Julie, for clarifying. I definitely understand your question better now. My answer is I don't know. My hope is that that whatever program they're being employed through is providing a contract with those fast food restaurants or what have you, where the fast food restaurants or other employers are paying them minimum wage or higher. And you also just reminded me of something I wanted to touch on but forgot to put in my PowerPoint, is that a lot of times with the 14C providers being the ones who connect with the employers don't often know that the people on the other end of that contract are getting paid less than minimum wage. And so what we found when DHS started funding this technical assistance for 14C providers who wanted to transition away from submin, we found that employers were like, what do you mean our employees aren't getting paid minimum wage? So I think to answer your question, it's program specific. But you can find out what program is running those services. And it's public information, completely public information on which providers are operating under 14C or not. And a quick Google search. Like that's what I do because we work at the ARC, we work with a lot of different providers, and it's hard to recall, who has 14C and not, or who does this service or that service, a quick Google search could help you with that too. And if you have, want to follow up offline, that's great too.
That kind of brings up another question. I'm glad you shared about the Google search. One of the questions also is 14C generally like supported employment service employers like RISE that have the 14C certificates, or can any employer obtain a 14C through a process or an application, or what does that look like?
I don't know how a 14C certificate is obtained, but I'm going to make a note to look into that because I feel like I should. But I do know that it's not just an employer that can do it. So, like, if I own a restaurant, I couldn't just go, I don't know. Sorry, Leslie.
No, that's okay.
Um, my understanding is that it has to be a disability services provider that obtains it as opposed to a business, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
It does. And then the disability provider contracts with the different businesses for the placement and working with the workers for those services.
Correct. And I think the goal is supposed to be, or initially was, originally the goal was supposed to be, okay, let's get disabled vets back into the workforce. But what it seems to be is has turned into a like an alternative employment situation. I don't know that there's a requirement for 14C providers to help service recipients work their way into the mainstream workforce, which is a gap that needs to be filled.
Yeah, which kind of brings up another question too. It was established, you said, in the Fair Labor Standards and that's the federal law. Is it still in there, but it's just kind of managed at the state level?
Yes, so it is federally legal, but the states have the opportunity and the right to change it at the state level, which is why those 18 states have been able to do so. The Federal Department of Labor just put out a request for public comment about a year ago, asking service providers, advocates, and states to provide input on whether or not they should remove it at the federal level. But after that request for comment was made, they rescinded it, and there hasn't been any movement at the federal level. So that's why it's looking like statewide, state to state is the best opportunity to get this changed. I will also say that the city of Minneapolis has reached out wondering if this is something that can be changed or moved away from at the city level. That again was also about a year ago, so I haven't seen a lot of movement on that. But it's just good to see different levels of government considering how this impacts constituents.
And do we know if there's any advocacy going on at the federal level for removing it?
I haven't heard anything since that public comment was rescinded about a year ago.
A couple other questions. It sounds like maybe people can look it up online, but do we know how many employers in Minnesota still have 14C certificates?
I will have to get back to you on how many 14C certificates are still in Minnesota, but I will say that in the last year or so, the number of employees working for less than minimum wage has gone down from about 3,400 to just over 2,000.
Well, that's a pretty good like drop then, isn't it? I mean, it's still
Yeah, and it
people
is.
working at
And
minimum
and
wage,
and
but
one of the arguments against removing 14C or outlawing it is that, well, it's going down on its own, so we don't really need to legislate this. We can just leave it and let it kind of fizzle out on its own. And that's great if it fizzles out on its own. But also we need, uh, from the ARC standpoint, we need to just legislate it out of potential option. We don't want to see it come back, If we do the legislation, we can get it out of here, and then people with disabilities can be focusing on competitive integrated employment as opposed to the potential for it to arise again.
and Another question is, do we know how many states still do have or still do pay sub-minimum wage?
So that's an interesting twist on one of my talking points, which is the 18 states have outlawed it. I don't know if the remaining states that haven't um, outlawed it, if they still have active 14C certificates. It's possible that just because they haven't outlawed it, they might just not have any 14C certificates. That's a really good question and a data point that I'll have to get back to you. Leslie, are you saving the chat? Are these all coming in the chat?
I do have the questions saved, so
Okay.
yep, not all in the chat, but I do have them saved.
Okay,
Yeah.
appreciate that. And I think that um, the questions that are coming up tonight will be questions I can expect from legislators moving forward. So it'll be good for me to have those talking points. So we'll do my research offline.
And could you talk or share a little bit more about how the change to the integrated employment that you were talking about, how that looks different and maybe some of the challenges or barriers? Are there any that you hear of in the ARC with the new model of the integrated employment?
Well, I will say that competitive integrated employment requires more time and focus on the individual. Um, But I will also say that that doesn't mean that we should get people into jobs that they have interest in, passion for, and the skills for. Um, this is going to be like a little bit of a nerdy example because I work in with the legislature. But one of my colleagues at the Autism Society, who I work with on elimination of subminimum wage, always uses this example. So, when you're thinking about legislation and committee hearings, they print hundreds of documents for each committee hearing for the legislators, for the public, for anybody who attends those committee hearings. What do they do with those documents afterwards? They shred them. Um, they have hired somebody who just likes that job and does that. And so that's the integrated employment. Like, what do you want to do? What's going to interest you for the amount of time that you want to be working, and like what does the community need? All of those things can match up if we're putting the time and effort into making those connections. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like I said, it does require a little bit more time and effort, but we all deserve that.
Which kind of it brings up another question that we have is we hear a lot about the ADA, American with Disabilities Act, and reasonable accommodations. Now, how is the integrated employment different, similar, and how does this kind of correlate or work with ADA requests for employees with disabilities? I think we think about it more with people with maybe physical disabilities, but they apply to all individuals. Um,
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I would love to get your thoughts or the group's thoughts on this. But I think with the ADA, it's more applied after you're employed as opposed to finding and getting employment. Does that make sense?
mhm.
Um, And to be completely honest, the ADA is also has always been a little bit mysterious to me. So for just to provide a different example, one of the other things that the ARC is working on is inclusive and accessible playgrounds. And when I talk to legislators about how we need to fund inclusive and accessible playgrounds, they say, well, my playground is already ADA compliant, so isn't that good? And that's not the same, right? And so like I think the ADA is just a little bit mysterious and inaccessible in general, especially before the employment process has started.
Thank you so much for being here this evening, Tina, and thank you, attendees, for joining us today. We really do appreciate your commitment to staying informed, asking thoughtful questions, and engaging in discussion that supports fair wages and meaningful employment opportunities for all Minnesotans. Thank you, QCTV, for hosting and recording this program and sharing it with your viewers. Good evening, everyone.